The first sign something was wrong wasn't the steal, it was the sound. I remember turning off Route 18 just after 7 in the morning, coffee still too hot to drink, windshield wipers dragging across that cold Oregon rain, and hearing this deep metallic slam echo through the trees behind my property. At first I thought maybe somebody wrecked a trailer on the county road or dumped scrap again. Happens more than you'd think out there. But when I pulled through the gate to my lot, I saw a flatbed semi sitting crooked in the mud beside my old storage barn, diesel smoke rolling into the drizzle like fog off a river. And stacked beside it were steel beams. Huge ones. Rust-colored I-beams, maybe 20 feet long, piled 4 high like somebody was building a damn bridge on my land. I just sat there gripping the steering wheel thinking, what the hell am I looking at right now? One of the workers hopped down from the trailer wearing an orange vest and one of those white hard hats covered in stickers. Guy looked maybe 25. Didn't even look surprised to see me. I rolled my window down and yelled, "Hey, you got the wrong property." He barely glanced over, just pointed at a clipboard and shouted back, "We're dropping where the paperwork says." Then he went right back to work like I was invisible. That part burned me more than anything. Not the steal, not the trespassing. The fact this kid looked at me like I was some random old man complaining about noise while they unloaded 5 tons of metal onto land my father bled for. See, that property wasn't just dirt to me. My dad bought it in 1987 after the mill shut down in Dry Creek. He used to tell me, "Land's the only thing they're not making more of, Danny." We weren't rich. Hell, we barely stayed afloat most years. But that patch of gravel and cedar trees was his pride. After he died from lung cancer, I kept it exactly how he left it. Same barn, same fence posts leaning sideways, same old chain by the gate that screeched every winter. So standing there watching strangers dump steel onto it felt weirdly personal, like somebody walking into your dead father's house and putting their feet on the table. I got out and tried one more time. "You can't leave this here." The older worker finally looked at me, cigarette hanging off his lip, rain dripping from the bill of his cap. "Buddy," he sighed, "you gotta call the developer. We just drive the truck." Then the semi pulled off, tires spinning mud everywhere, and just like that, they were gone, leaving me alone with all that steel sitting in the rain like a middle finger. I remember walking around it afterward, hearing the gravel crunch under my boots, trying to process whether this was incompetence or arrogance. Maybe both. One of the beams had a company name spray painted on the side in white letters. Blackridge Urban Development. Fancy name. Sounded like the kind of company that tears down warehouses and puts up luxury apartments with fake farmhouse sinks and $6 coffee downstairs. I called the number right there standing in the rain. Woman answers with that polished corporate voice, the kind where you can practically hear the smile through the phone. "Blackridge Development, this is Melissa." I told her there were steel beams dumped on my property and I wanted them removed immediately. She paused for maybe half a second too long before saying, "Oh yes, that's temporary staging for the Riverside Tower project." Temporary staging. Like she was talking about folding chairs at a church picnic. I said, "Ma'am, this is private land." Another pause. Then she goes, "We'll have somebody handle it." Click. Hung up on me. I just stood there in the rain holding my phone thinking, did that really just happen? And the crazy part is, for the next 2 weeks, nothing happened. Nobody called. Nobody showed up. The steel just sat there soaking in rainwater while orange rust bled into puddles around my barn. Every morning I'd walk out there with coffee and stare at it, getting angrier each day. My neighbor Earl started joking that I should charge admission and call it modern art. Even my friend Linda laughed and said, "Hell, Danny, maybe they're building you a skyscraper." But underneath the jokes, everybody knew what was happening. Big company sees old guy with quiet property out near the county edge and assumes he'll roll over. And honestly, maybe 10 years earlier I would have. But grief changes you. Losing my dad changed me. You get real sensitive to disrespect after burying the only person who ever taught you how to stand your ground. So on the 12th day, I drove into town, paid extra for certified mail, and sent Blackridge their first legal removal notice. And that was the moment this whole thing stopped being an accident and started becoming a fight. Now here's the part nobody tells you about dealing with corporations. They count on exhaustion. They assume regular people have jobs, bills, bad knees, family problems, and eventually you'll get tired enough to stop pushing. Blackridge definitely thought that about me. I could feel it in every interaction after that first notice went out. A week passed, Then another. Nothing. No phone call. No apology. No trucks coming to retrieve the steel. Just silence. Cold, calculated silence. Meanwhile, those beams sat there turning darker every time it rained, puddles collecting underneath them like little rust-colored ponds. Some mornings I'd stand at the barn door staring at them while drinking burnt coffee from the same old thermos my dad used to carry to the mill, and I'd hear his voice in my head clear as day. If somebody thinks you're weak, don't argue with them. Let them find out the expensive way. Funny thing is, my father wasn't an aggressive man. Quiet guy. But he understood leverage better than anybody I ever knew. Around that time, my neighbor Earl drove over on his ATV, carrying 2 gas station burritos and a 6-pack. Earl's one of those retired mechanics who somehow always smells like transmission fluid and cedar smoke. He looked over at the steel and whistled. "Danny, you know how much money this crap's worth?" I shrugged. "More than my truck." He laughed so hard beer almost came out his nose. "No, seriously. That's structural steel. Somebody's losing sleep over this somewhere." And for the first time since the drop-off happened, I smiled. Not because I wanted revenge exactly, but because I realized something important. Blackridge wasn't ignoring me because the steel didn't matter. They were ignoring me because they assumed I didn't matter. Huge difference. That night, I started digging through county code online. Took me 3 hours because county websites look like they were built during the Clinton administration, but eventually I found a section buried under abandoned commercial property regulations. I must have read it 10 times just to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding it. Property left on private land after formal notice, unclaimed beyond 30 days, may legally transfer through abandonment claim procedures. I leaned back in my chair staring at the screen while rain hammered the roof over my kitchen. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I actually laughed out loud alone in the house like some crazy person, because suddenly the whole thing flipped. They thought they were bullying some quiet landowner into free storage. But according to county law, they might have accidentally gifted me a pile of steel worth more than my yearly income. Next morning I called Linda. Now Linda owned a small salvage yard outside Brook Hollow and knew more about metal prices than anybody I'd ever met. Tough woman too. Smoked cigarettes like punctuation marks. I told her everything. Long silence on the phone. Then she goes, "Danny, if this paperwork checks out, do not screw around. Document every damn thing." And that became our mission. For the next week, we treated that steel pile like a crime scene. Photos with timestamps, video walkthroughs, copies of every certified letter. Earl signed a witness affidavit confirming he watched the delivery happen. Linda even made me measure every single beam while she recorded inventory numbers on a yellow legal pad. At one point, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "You know they're going to come back swinging when they realize what happened." I said, "Good." But truthfully, I was nervous as hell, because deep down I kept wondering if I was pushing too far. There's this weird guilt regular people carry when dealing with wealthy companies. Like somehow defending yourself feels rude while they're busy screwing you over. And Blackridge absolutely leaned into that psychology. About 4 days before the deadline expired, I got a voicemail from some regional operations manager named Scott Mercer. Guy had one of those smooth, rich guy voices where every sentence sounds vaguely threatening even when he's being polite. "Mr. Holloway, we understand there's been a misunderstanding regarding temporary material storage on your property. We'd appreciate your cooperation while we coordinate retrieval." Misunderstanding. That word irritated me more than trespassing. Like my property line just accidentally wandered underneath 5 tons of their steel. I called him back immediately. He answered on the second ring. "Scott Mercer." I said, "You got my notices." "Yes, and we're working internally on logistics. 30-day deadline stands." Silence. Then a little chuckle. Not friendly either. Condescending. "Mr. Holloway, these are commercial construction assets tied to active development contracts. I don't think you fully understand the legal complications here." And there it was. The voice corporations use when they think intimidation works better than accountability. I remember looking out my kitchen window at the rain coming down sideways through the trees and suddenly feeling very calm. "No," I told him. "I understand perfectly." Then I hung up. Linda nearly fell out of her chair laughing when I told her. "Oh my God," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. "You pissed off a developer." But underneath the humor, things were escalating fast. 3 days before the deadline, somebody drove past my property around midnight shining headlights through the gate. Earl saw it too from his trailer across the road. Next afternoon, another Blackridge employee showed up unannounced in loafers too expensive for gravel roads and tried taking photos without speaking to me. I walked outside and asked if he needed something. Guy barely looked up from his phone, just assessing inventory. Inventory. Like it already belonged to them no matter whose land it sat on. I said, "You planning on removing it?" He shrugged. "Not my department." Then he got back in his BMW and left. That was the exact moment my sympathy died completely. Because until then, part of me still believed maybe this was incompetence. Maybe paperwork confusion. Maybe bad communication between contractors. But no, this was entitlement. Pure and simple. They genuinely believed rules applied differently to them because they had money and lawyers and active construction permits. Meanwhile, every person around me started getting invested in the story. Earl checked the deadline like it was the Super Bowl countdown. Linda kept calling asking if anyone showed up. Even the woman at the county clerk's office recognized my name by the second filing and whispered, "You're the steel guy, right?" Which honestly became kind of hilarious. Small towns love drama as long as it's not happening to them. Finally, April 24th arrived. Gray skies. Light rain. Typical Pacific Northwest misery. I drove into Brook Hollow with a binder full of documents sitting on the passenger seat, so thick it looked like I was suing the federal government. Every notice, every photo, every witness statement, every timestamp. I walked into the county administration building at exactly 9:42 in the morning feeling like I was either about to do something incredibly smart or catastrophically stupid. The clerk behind the counter adjusted her glasses while flipping through my paperwork. "You documented all this yourself?" she asked. "Every bit." She kept reading. More silence. Then finally she stamped the top page hard enough to echo across the room. "Claim accepted pending final review." I swear my knees almost buckled from adrenaline. By 3:11 that afternoon, approval came through. Legal transfer under abandoned commercial property statute. Just like that, the steel was mine. Legally. Completely. I sat in my truck afterwards staring at the paperwork while rain tapped against the windshield. And for the first time in weeks, I actually felt bad for Blackridge. Because they had no idea what was waiting for them the next morning. I barely slept that night. Not because I was scared anymore. Honestly, it was excitement. The kind that keeps your brain running in circles at 3 in the morning replaying conversations you wish had gone differently. Except this time, for once, they actually had. I got up before sunrise, made coffee strong enough to peel paint, and walked out onto the property while fog rolled low through the cedar trees. The steel beams sat there covered in dew, quiet and motionless, and I remember putting my hand against one of them thinking, well, I guess you're mine now. It felt absurd, like I'd somehow slipped into somebody else's story. Around 8:30, I heard tires crunching hard on gravel. Fast. Aggressive. I turned and saw a silver Denali flying through the open gate, so quickly it fishtailed near the barn. Driver's door slammed open before the engine even stopped. Guy comes storming toward me in a charcoal raincoat, expensive watch flashing under the gray sky, face already red with anger. I recognized him immediately from Blackridge's website. Scott Mercer. In person, he looked exactly like the type of man who'd complain to a restaurant manager because his sparkling water wasn't cold enough. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he barked before he even reached me. No hello. No introduction. Just straight to outrage. I stayed leaning against the beam sipping coffee. "Morning to you too." That made him even angrier. "You filed a seizure claim on private commercial inventory?" I nodded once. "Abandoned property claim. This material is tied to active construction contracts." Should have picked it up then. He stared at me for a second like nobody had ever spoken to him that way before. Then he pulled the classic corporate maneuver, sudden fake calm. Guys like him always do that when yelling stops working. He straightened his coat and lowered his voice. "Mr. Holloway, let's be reasonable here." Reasonable. Funny word coming from a man who left 5 tons of steel on somebody else's land for over a month. "You were notified repeatedly," I said. 3 certified notices. There were internal delays. Not my problem. You don't understand the financial implications this creates. I actually laughed at that. Couldn't help it. Because for weeks I'd been treated like some irrelevant obstacle standing in the way of their schedule, and suddenly now they wanted to discuss implications. Scott took another step closer. "Look, whatever this is, we can settle it right now. Name a number." There it was. Not apology. Not accountability. Just money. Like everything in life existed on a balance sheet. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the stamped county approval paperwork, and handed it to him. He snatched it so hard the pages bent. I watched his expression change while he read. Anger first, then confusion, then this beautiful little flicker of panic right around the eyes. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "County approved it yesterday," I said. 3:11 p.m. He flipped pages faster. "You can't just take commercial inventory." Apparently I can. Rain started coming down harder then, tapping against the steel beams while Scott stood there getting soaked, staring at paperwork that legally turned his company's mistake into my property. Honestly, that moment felt less like victory and more like watching somebody realize the rules actually applied to them. And weirdly enough, I think that's what upset him most. Not the money. The fact some ordinary guy on a muddy piece of land had beaten them at their own game. He handed the paperwork back slowly, jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "This isn't over." I shrugged. "Seems over to me." Then he got back into the Denali and tore out of my property, spraying mud everywhere like an angry teenager. Earl drove over 10 minutes later, practically vibrating with excitement. "Was that him?" he yelled before stopping his ATV. "That the developer guy?" I nodded. Earl started laughing so hard, he had to grab the handlebars for support. "Danny," he wheezed, "you realize this is the greatest thing that's happened in this county since the Walmart caught fire." And somehow, he wasn't wrong. Word spread ridiculously fast after that. By afternoon, even the cashier at Miller's Grocery was asking me about the stolen steel situation, which technically wasn't stolen at all, but good luck explaining legal nuance to small-town gossip. 2 days later, Linda helped broker a sale through one of her supplier contacts. And here's the part that still cracks me up. The buyer turned out to be one of Blackridge's own subcontractors trying to replace the exact same steel they lost. $14,000. That's what landed in my account after everything cleared. 14 grand because a billion-dollar development company thought nobody would challenge them. I used part of the money to finally replace the roof on my barn, something my dad had talked about doing for years before he got sick. Rest of it went into savings, because life has a way of humbling you right after you start feeling too proud. And Blackridge? Their Riverside project stalled 6 months later. Financing issues, permit delays, lawsuits. Depends who you ask. Last time I drove through Brook Hollow, the site was still sitting half-finished behind chain-link fencing, cranes frozen against the skyline like giant skeletons. Sometimes I wonder if Scott Mercer ever thinks about me when he passes that empty lot. I know I would. The strange thing is, I don't actually hate those people anymore. For a while I did. But eventually, I realized the steel was never really the point. The point was respect. Or the lack of it. Somewhere along the way, companies like that get so used to moving fast and throwing weight around that they stop seeing ordinary people as obstacles with rights and histories and memories attached to the land they stand on. To them, my property was just empty space on a map. But to me, it was my father's fingerprints on old fence posts. It was summers fixing engines under the barn. It was every hard year we somehow survived. And maybe that sounds sentimental over a pile of rusty steel beams. But if you've ever inherited something from somebody you loved, you probably understand exactly what I mean. Still, I'll admit this whole thing raises an interesting question. Because depending who you ask, I'm either the guy who stood up to a greedy developer or the guy who exploited a legal loophole for profit. Honestly, maybe there's truth in both. So I'm curious what you think. If somebody leaves valuable property on your land, ignores every warning, then suddenly panics when the law stops favoring them, are you wrong for taking advantage of that? Or is that just accountability finally catching up? Let me know in the comments, because around here, people still argue about it.